We're on DAF Beis Amud Aleph, and we were learning yesterday that there were three different kinds of measurements for this scarlet string that's supposed to be used in three different services. We have the service of the Paraduma, we have the service of the Seir HaMishtaleach, the Yom Kippur goat, and we have the service of the Mitzorah. And we had seen that there are different measurements. At least according to one opinion, the Paraduma string has to be the heaviest because it has to weigh down. So the Gemara had suggested that that really heavy weight of 4 zuz of string was for the Paraduma. The Seir HaMishtaleach string doesn't have to be as heavy, but it has to be somewhat heavy because you have to cut it in half. So therefore that's the 2 selah measurement. And the 1 shekel measurement, that was for the string of the Mitzorah. That's what we saw yesterday. Now the Gemara is going to give us another opinion. On Daf Beis Amud Aleph, on the third line, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Pligi bar Reb Shimon ben Chalafta v'Rabbanan b'Para. There's a machlokes between these two groups regarding the string of the Paraduma. Chad Omar Mishkal Asara v'Chad Omar Mishkal Shekel. And it's an argument of extremes, because one opinion is that it has to be so heavy that it has to weigh as much as 4 zuz, and the other Manda Omar goes all the way to the other extreme, that it doesn't have to be heavy at all, and therefore it could just be the weight of 1 shekel. Okay, so you see an argument of extremes, and by the way, we had seen this machlokas yesterday, whether the string of the paraduma has to have koved, whether it has to have weight to weigh it down and so that it can burn within the carcass of the para. V'simonecha echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamet. The way to remember that this machlokas is a machlokas of extremes is from the Mishnah that says echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamet. It makes no difference whether you give a lot or you give a little, as long as your heart is focused towards heaven. And that the idea, therefore, is this is just a mnemonic reminder. One holds that it's got to be a lot, the most heavy, and the other one that it can be the most light. Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti l'Ravina lo bepara pligi ela b'sir mishtaleach pligi. He says, despite your helpful mnemonic, you got the machlokas wrong. They weren't arguing about the weight of the string of the paraduma. They were arguing about the weight of the string of the Seir HaMishtaleach. Ve'ahu YOMA nach nafshei de Rabbi Barkisi ve'anchu basimna Rabbi Barkisi mechaper kisir HaMishtaleach. And not only that, but I have another mnemonic. The day that that machlokus was debated was the day that a rabbi named Rabbi Barkisi passed away. And people were saying, to associate the machlokas about the thread of the Seir Mishtaleach to the death of Rabbi Barkisi, that Rabbi Barkisi atones for the sins of the Jewish people, just like the Seir HaMishtaleach on Yom Kippur atones. Meaning, like Rashi points out, the death of the righteous is an atoning factor. That's why, what is the name of the parsha which contains the laws of Yom Kippur in the Torah? Acharei Mos, because it's Acharei Mos Shnei Bnei Aharon. So what you learn from there is just like Yom Kippur is Mechaper, so too the deaths of Tzadikim, Nadav and Avihu is Mechaper. So that's why they made this mnemonic reminder. So basically we have a machlokas as to what the machlokas is. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak shtei shchitos shamati, echa shel para ve'echa shel paro, echas kashera bizar ve'echas pesula bizar ve'lo yadana heminayu. So Rabbi Yitzchak makes the following statement. I heard 2 halachos having to do with the laws of shchita. In one case, it's kosher to shecht with a non-kohen, and in the other case, you can only shecht with a kohen. And one of them was para aduma, and the other one was the par of the kohen gadol on Yom Kippur. And I don't know which one is which. I don't know whether it's okay to shecht with a zar, a non-kohen, for the para aduma, or whether it's okay to shecht with a zar for the par of the kohen gadol on Yom Kippur. So itmar, and now we're going to see that this is a machlokes. Shchitas para u paro, Rav u Shmuel chad omar para pesula paro keshera, v'chad omar paro pesula para keshera. This is a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Between Rav and Shmuel, one holds that for the paraduma you cannot use a zar, but you can for the par of Yom Kippur, and the other one holds vice versa. So the Gemara says, Tistayim de Ravu de Omar para pesula. Let us conclude that Rav in this machlokes must be the one who says that for the para aduma a zar is not kosher. How do we know this? The Amar Rabbi Zera shchitas para bizar pesula, because Rabbi Zera was quoted as saying that you cannot use a zar to shech the para aduma, and va'amar Rav Allah el azar v'chuka shaninu ba. And Rav, in explaining Rabbi Zera's halacha, said the reason for Rabbi Zera's halacha that you cannot use a zar is because when the Torah talks about the protocol for the paraduma, it says Elazar. Elazar is the prototypical Kohen. But it also says chukah. It says that this is the statute. This is the way it must be done. So you see that only Elazar can be working on the para aduma, and therefore a zar cannot work on the para aduma. What do you see from here? You see that Rav is supporting Reb Zera's halacha that you cannot use a zar for the para aduma. So it must be that Rav holds you cannot use a zar, and Shmuel holds you could use a zar for the para aduma, and it's only for the par of Yom Kippur, according to Shmuel, that you cannot use a zar. So now the Gemara is going to question Rav's reasoning. You're telling me it's because of the verbiage in the pasuk. V'Rav Maishna para dichsiv Elazar v'chuka paronami haksiv Aaron v'chuka. I don't understand. If Rab is basing it on the verbiage in the pasuk of Yipara Aduma, because it says Elazar, and it says that this is the way it's got to be because of the word Chukah, but if you look in the laws of Yom Kippur in the Torah, you'll also see it says Aharon, and Aharon's a Kohen too, and it says Chukah, it's got to be done this way, and there the laws of Shechita are described too, so it would seem that the very same argument that Rab is using to disqualify a zar for Paraduma should be the very same disqualification for a zar for Yom Kippur. So the Gemara answers to explain Rav. He says Shechita lav avodahi. The answer is that Shechita is not an avoda. So therefore, on Yom Kippur, the only thing that has to be done by Aharon is the actual sacrificial service. But if it's not part of the sacrificial service, like Shechita, like we've learned before in Maseches Chulin and Maseches Zvachim, a zar is allowed to shecht other karbanos. So therefore, the argument would be the same thing as on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, but by that token, ihachi paranami. Well, then say the same thing by the paraduma. Even though it says shachat and it talks about Elazar, Elazar's only doing the avoda, not doing the shechita. Answers the Gemara, shiny para dekachi berakabayasi. The Gemara says, listen, you got to realize, the whole process of the paraduma is not an avoda. Because the kedusha that is imbued within the para aduma is not kedusha saguf like a korban, but rather it's only a financial kedusha, and therefore it's not even considered sacrificial at all. The para aduma in this context, and as a result, there's no distinction to be made between shechita and any other process or protocol that you do with the para aduma. So if the Torah says Elazar by the para aduma, it means the whole thing. Everything from Shechita through the end is all on the same playing field. Whereas by Yom Kippur, Shechita is inherently different from everything else that's done because you're dealing with a sacrificial animal. And with the sacrificial animals, the protocols of sprinkling and collecting the blood, etc., are part of what's called avoda, whereas the Shechita is not part of the formal avoda, and that's why you can make that distinction. So for the Gemara V'lav Kol Dekenhu, I don't understand. It should be a Kal V'chomer. If when it comes to something that is sacrificial in nature, you don't need to use a Kohen to do the Shechita, then surely when it comes to something that is non-sacrificial in nature, you should be allowed to use a zar. That seems to be one of the ways so that would seem to be one of the ways to ask this question. So Amar Rav Shisha Berei de Ravidi Mida Dahava Amaros Nagoyim Delav Avoda Hi Ubaya Kahuna. So the Gemara answers as follows. He says you can't make a Kal V'chomer because you see that there are certain times when there are certain things that Kohanim have to do that have nothing to do with Avoda. Meaning that just because you find by sacrificial work that a Kohen is not needed for Shechita, so you wanted to make the argument then, well, if that's the argument, then, look, if you need to do shechita for something that's non-sacrificial, surely you should need to do shechita for something that is sacrificial. In other words, if you need a kohen for the non-sacrificial shechita, then surely you should need a kohen for sacrificial shechita. The Gemara says no. You see that there are certain processes and protocols that Kohanim need to do that are not part of the sacrificial genre, and yet it can only be done by a Kohen. What's an example? An example is the pronouncement of tsaras. That's completely non-sacrificial, and yet the Torah says that only a Kohen can declare someone tameh with tumas tsaras. If a Yisrael inspects your lesion and says that it's tsaras, it means nothing halachically. So therefore you see that there's one realm of halacha that has to do with karbanos, and there we find that Kohanim exclusively must be used. But there's another realm of halacha that is non-sacrificial in nature, where also only Kohanim can be used. So therefore, you find that when it comes to karbanos, shechita does not have to be done by a Kohen. But there are certain non-sacrificial processes and protocols that do require a Kohen, such as the paraduma, and there shechita is required by a Kohen as well. So now the Gemara says, "V'lishmul da'amar paro pesula ma'ishna paro dichsiv Aaron v'chuka paranami haksiv Elazar v'chuka." Now let's go to Shmuel. We've analyzed Rav so far. Now let's analyze Shmuel. Shmuel says that you are allowed to use a zar for the paraduma, but you cannot use a zar for the sira mishtalech for Yom Kippur. The question is, why not? So the Gemara says, because Shmuel looks at the pasuk of Yom Kippur, and it says in the pasuk of Yom Kippur, Aharon, and it says Chuka. So he says that that's what the Torah requires. It requires always that a Kohen must be involved with the whole process. So the Gemara says, but by that argument, what about the fact that it says Elazar and Chuka by the Paraduma? So the Gemara answers, Shiny Hasam Dichsiv Shachat Osa Lefanav Sheyehizar Shochet Ve'elazar Roeh. The Gemara answers because of the verbiage in the pasuk by paraduma shchita. It says by the paraduma shchita, b'shachat osa lefanav, he shall slaughter it in his presence. Who's he and who's in his presence? So it must be that in his presence means in Elazar's presence. It means that there's another person shechting the cow in Elazar's presence, and that tells you that it doesn't have to be Elazar.